and I cannot thank you enough for the love and sympathy you have shown our whole family. It is a belief in the extraordinary ability of each person to touch with goodness and compassion. Around Easter, King Charles made a startling discovery that sent shock waves through Buckingham Palace. Join us as we reveal the amazing story of Maid Lena and the moment that shook the royal household to its core. You may have heard people say Buckingham Palace is full of secrets. Behind the shiny gates and tall walls, things happen that the world never gets to see. Most people assume it's all fancy dinners, gold rooms, and important guests walking around with glasses of expensive wine. And sure, there's plenty of that. But deep inside, there's another world which is made up of the staff, the people who clean, cook, serve, and keep the palace running while staying completely invisible. One of those people was a maid named Elena. Amongst the maids in the royal family, Elena stood out from the others. According to sources close to the palace, Elena didn't chat much. She never gossiped in the staff kitchen and never showed where she wasn't needed. Most of the maids had nicknames, but Elena was always just the quiet one who was known for minding her business. She kept her head down, did her job, and moved like a shadow in the background. People barely noticed her. But something happened that changed that completely. It all started on a Wednesday afternoon. It was the day several international guests were visiting the palace. A group of diplomats had arrived from different parts of the world for a royal round table with King Charles. All they knew was that it meant extra work and extra stress. Fortunately, Ilelina had been assigned to clean one of the guest parlors where the visitors would wait before meeting King Charles. The room was spotless, the flowers freshly arranged, and the tea set placed perfectly on the table. The other maids had already left. Elena was dusting the corner shelves when she heard voices coming down the hall. A group of men in dark suits and traditional clothes from different countries stepped inside. Some spoke English, but most didn't. They spoke in quick, sharp words Elena understood but didn't react to them. The guests were speaking in a foreign language, trying to communicate with King Charles' staff, but no one could understand them. From the way they spoke, it was obvious a palace interpreter was needed, but there was a problem. The royal translator was nowhere to be found. No one knew where he'd gone. The other staff panicked quietly because a diplomat from China was trying to ask for something and no one understood him. A man from Egypt tried to explain in broken English while another from France tried to help, only making it worse. The palace staff aren't trained for this sort of thing. They can carry trays and clean windows, but no one expects them to jump into a room full of diplomats and fix an international misunderstanding. So the room filled with nervous laughter and awkward looks. Then something unexpected happened. Elena, who was still holding and dressing the teacup, intervened and interpreted what the Chinese diplomat meant. After she interpreted, the room froze, and in awe, the Chinese diplomat turned to look at her. He answered her quickly, asking about the schedule and whether he was expected to remove his shoes before entering a certain room. Elena replied fluently, explaining the palace's customs. Are you surprised? Well, that was just the beginning. Keep watching to find out what happens next. One of the French diplomats, out of curiosity, asked her something in French. Without missing a beat, Elena responded, clear, natural, like she'd been speaking French all her life. By this point, even the guards outside the room were peeking in, trying to see what was going on. The staff were frozen in shock. The other maids stood by the door, mouths open. The conversation switched rapidly from one language, kept up with every word like it was the most normal thing in the world. That's when King Charles himself walked by. He had been on his way to greet the guests with two advisors following close behind. From the hallway he heard the voices, a mix of languages flying back and forth. That wasn't unusual. The palace hosted all kinds of people, but then he heard something that made him stop mid-step. Someone was speaking in Latin. Not the old stiff Latin you hear in church, but fluent casual Latin, and whoever it was, they weren't diplomats. King Charles turned his head toward the doorway and saw her a maid. In a mild voice he asked the adviser following him who was the maid interacting with his guests. Remember, Elelina was said to be the quiet and low-key maid. The adviser Deco not recognized her from the other maids. When Elelina noticed the king for a split second, she thought she was in trouble. Her stomach dropped. This was not the kind of attention a maid wanted. She was supposed to stay in the background, never speak unless spoken to, and certainly never get involved in diplomatic conversations. When King Charles eventually stepped into the guest room, his face was unreadable. The entire group went quiet. Every guest bowed slightly to give a respectful nod. Elena kept her head down, her heart pounding in her ears. He walked over to Elena, then something unexpected happened. To test the maid's ability, King Charles spoke to her in a calm, clear voice in Greek, asking if she understood the language. Without hesitation, Elena responded in perfect Greek, her voice steady and composed. After their brief exchange, a long, stunned silence hung in the air. The king raised an eyebrow. Placing his hands behind his back, he gave a small approving nod. Then, in front of everyone, and with no further explanation, he turned to one of his staff and said, "Have her sent to my study now." The diplomats whispered among themselves. Palace staff exchanged witty-eyed glances. No one could recall anything like this ever happening before. Elena stood frozen, unsure if her legs would move. Then came Mrs. Winthrop, the head of staff, a stern, sharp-eyed woman who ruled over the maids like a drill sergeant. Without wasting a moment, she hurried in and took charge. Within minutes, Elena was being led through the palace. Past rooms she had only ever cleaned, never dared to enter. The king's private study was a place few servants ever laid eyes on. And now, for reasons she couldn't yet understand, she was about to cross that line. Whatever was waiting for her on the other side, she knew one thing for sure. Life at Buckingham Palace was never going to be the same again. And this was just the beginning. According to royal insiders, after King Charles finished his meeting with the diplomats, he went straight to his private study, a room that looked like something out of a history book. It was the perfect picture of old tradition, and there, waiting for him, was the maid. King Charles stood by the window, his hands folded behind his back, his shoulders stiff beneath his perfectly tailored suit. He didn't even glance at Elena as she stepped inside. His mind was still turning over what he had witnessed. How could a maid of all people casually speak flawless Mandarin, Arabic, French, and Russian like it was the most natural thing in the world? The whole thing felt impossible, and yet it had happened right in front of him. When King Charles finally turned to look at her, the tension on Elena's face said everything. She didn't know if she was about to be praised or dismissed. Could it be that the king was going to fire her for getting involved in royal matters she had no business with? In a very calm voice, King Charles ordered her to sit, pointing to the high-backed chair across from his desk. Without hesitation, Elena obeyed, sitting upright with her face calm but her eyes watchful. She knew what this was. No one was summoned to this room for casual conversation. You can tell that the tension on Elena was high. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Charles studied her as though she were a puzzle piece that didn't fit anywhere on his carefully arranged board. After a few minutes, the king asked to know who she was without any evasions. Clever tricks. There was no warmth in the words as he spoke to her with authority. After the king's question, Elena took a steadying breath and spoke. She introduced herself as Elena Morcos, daughter of the distinguished Professor Elias Morcos, a respected linguist. According to a royal insider, the moment she said her father's name, something flickered across King Charles's face. It was clear that this was a name he recognized. In a voice that wavered slightly, Elena explained that her father was a man of many languages and many countries. He worked with governments, universities, and scholars from all over the world. She grew up in a house where one language was spoken in the morning and a different one by evening. It was the only life she had ever known. After the introduction, King Charles said nothing. His eyes stayed fixed on her, unreadable but intense. He let out a long, careful breath, his expression tightening as if holding back something. He walked over to his desk, placed a hand on the back of the chair, but chose not to sit. Then, in a voice so soft it barely reached her ears, he asked where her father was now. Elena's reply was unexpected and tragic, and what she revealed next would leave everyone stunned. "Keep watching. What's about to happen will surprise you." Elena told him everything. The horrors that shaped her life, the years she spent being passed from one set of hands to another like she was nothing. She spoke of being taken, trafficked, dragged across borders like a shadow no one saw. North Africa, the Middle East, scattered corners of Europe. In every place she survived by learning the language, the customs, the rules you didn't dare break. Every word she picked up, every gesture she copied was a way to stay alive. The firelight danced across King Charles's face, and for the first time he looked older than the man the world saw in polished portraits and public speeches. His jaw clenched, and he didn't say a word, but his silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. Elena kept going. She told him how she made it to this country, how forged papers gave her a new name, and how the life of a palace cleaner was the one place she could disappear. No one noticed a maid, not in a place like this. That was the unspoken rule of royal households. And yet she admitted she hadn't planned to stay. The palace was supposed to be a stopover, just another hiding place before she moved on. But something about the stillness, the strict routines, the way everything stayed where it belonged, spoke to a part of her she didn't even know was still alive. In a world that had taken everything, this was a place where days made sense. When she finished, the room fell silent. The weight of her story hung thick in the air. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And then King Charles did something no one in that study expected. He gave a thin, humorless smile. It wasn't one of warmth, but the kind of bitter acknowledgement you see in a man who realizes a truth he's ignored for too long. People like him rarely notice the ones moving quietly around them. The maids, the drivers, the nameless faces behind the curtains, but maybe they should. He didn't shower her with sympathy. That wasn't the way of this place. Instead, he spoke in a voice low and measured. The story was extraordinary, yes, but inside these walls, stories didn't count for much. What mattered was how she had made it this far into his palace, into his world, without a single person noticing. Either his staff had failed him in ways that would soon be dealt with, or this woman standing before him was a master at vanishing in plain sight, probably both. Their conversation shifted to languages. Charles demanded proof. He wanted to hear it. Elena didn't flinch. She corrected him softly, not 9 languages, 11, and before anyone could catch their breath, she began. One by one she named them. Each word she spoke rolled off her tongue in flawless native cadence. Mandarin, Arabic, Greek, Russian, French, Italian, Persian, German, Portuguese, Spanish, and a bit of Turkish. Persian, German, Portuguese, Spanish, and a bit of Turkish. The room seemed to hold its breath. Charles didn't say a word. His face didn't shift, but something in the room's air did. That subtle kind of change you feel in your gut before anyone even speaks. It was unspoken, but it was there, reluctant respect. Right then and there, King Charles made a decision. Quick, absolute. No more scrubbing floors, no more cleaning rooms. He was going to have her reassigned immediately, placed under his direct authority. The job didn't exist yet, but it would by tomorrow, linguistic advisor. That's what he'd call it. Let anyone question it if they were bold enough. Not long after, King Charles called Elena back in along with the royal advisor and laid out the plan. He ordered the advisor to handle the paperwork and make the necessary arrangements first thing in the morning. Elena, her voice trembling with joy, thanked the king, but what he said next stopped everyone cold. In a calm, steady voice, Charles looked at her and said, "This isn't kindness, it's a necessity. This palace has one interpreter, and he's nowhere to be found." The room went silent again. No one argued, no one dared. Elena left the study, the heavy doors closing behind her. But that wasn't the end of it. Remember, Prince William is already working to streamline the royal family. So, when King Charles eventually passes on, what will Elena's place be? And will the other officials at Buckingham Palace accept the king's decision? We'll get to that in the next chapter, so don't go anywhere. Now, here's where it gets wild. The news of King Charles appointing a maid as his personal linguistic advisor spread through the palace faster than wildfire. It didn't happen in front of cameras, no grand event, no formal announcement to the world. It came quietly, slipped into the day's official notices with a short, sharp letter to palace staff and senior advisors. One line. That's all it took. Effective immediately, Elena is appointed as His Majesty's personal linguistic advisor. No explanation, no ceremony. But that single line hit the palace like a thunderclap. Reaction started with the old guards. They couldn't openly protest. Not with Charles still sitting on the throne. But according to one palace worker, most of the people in the palace were not happy about the appointment. The message was loud and clear. This was an insult, a disgrace. Never in Buckingham Palace's long, rigid history had a servant been raised to such a post. Tradition had been slapped in the face, and the old guard wasn't having it. But it didn't stop with them. The murmuring spilled over to the senior advisors, the real power behind the throne. These were men and women who'd spent their entire careers clawing their way up the royal ladder. People who'd studied at Oxford, spoken at international conferences, and advised generations of royals on matters of protocol and diplomacy. And now, overnight, they were being outranked by a maid. To them, Elena's appointment wasn't just some odd passing decision. It was a direct challenge to everything they'd built their lives around. During one heated panel meeting with the king, one of the senior advisors finally snapped. In a tight formal voice, he called the king's decision reckless, said it set a dangerous precedent, that it could unravel centuries of carefully maintained tradition. The room went tense, all eyes on Charles. And true to his nature, the king didn't raise his voice or get drawn into a debate. He listened, nodded once, and calmly replied with a single word. Noted, that was it. No long speeches, no back and forth. Decision final. And that quiet dismissal, that unshakable authority, made them even angrier. Downstairs, in the palace kitchens and staff quarters, the gossip was relentless. Elena had once scrubbed those very floors, peeled those same potatoes, and carried silver trays through the same hallways. Now she was walking beside the king. Her old colleagues couldn't decide whether to be proud, jealous, or just plain shocked. Behind closed doors, some were convinced she must have done something to win the king's favor. Rumors spread like wildfire. Amid all the noise, a few quietly admired her. The junior staff, the immigrants, the overlooked workers tucked away in the palace's forgotten corners saw Elena as a kind of symbol. If she could rise, maybe one day someone like them could too, but even they didn't dare show it. In a place like Buckingham Palace, going against tradition was dangerous business. According to reports, Elena felt the shift right away. People she'd shared laughs and meals with now avoided her. Conversations would stop cold the moment she stepped into a room. Orders came with stiff, cold formality. For the formal maid, things were never the same again. She wasn't Alina anymore. She was Miss Alina. The king's favor meant no one openly challenged her. But the looks, the quiet, and the isolation said everything. If you think the opposition to her appointment was over, well, what you are about to witness will surprise you. A few days after her appointment, during a small diplomatic briefing, a senior advisor made a sharp jab at Alina. Charles looked up from his papers. "Some decisions are made precisely because they cannot wait," he replied. The room fell silent. Behind the scenes, high-ranking officials began murmuring about the king's judgment. Was he losing it? Was this Alina's situation a sign of poor leadership? A few even sent quiet messages to Clarence House, from where Prince William was observing the situation carefully. In William's vision, the royal family should be smaller, leaner, and more modern. He had submitted a proposal for cutting out unnecessary roles and bring the institution more nearer to the people. And now, with his father promoting a maid to a position of influence, those plans faced a new question. Some insiders believed William wouldn't hesitate to quietly remove her. Others argued that he might see value in her, especially if she could prove herself useful in future diplomatic meetings. After all, having someone who could switch between Mandarin, Arabic, French, Russian, and ancient Greek wasn't something you found every day. But for now, no one knew for sure. As for Charles, he didn't back down. In private meetings, he continued to consult Alina, asking for her input during delicate conversations with foreign delegates. He valued her perspective, her understanding of nuance, and the fact that she had lived a life most people in that palace couldn't imagine. To him, that made her invaluable. And while the backlash inside Buckingham Palace was fierce outside the palace gates, the public was beginning to take notice. Some hailed the move as a bold step forward. Others called it reckless. Newspapers ran headlines like "King's Maid turned advisor, modern monarchy," or royal mess radio shows debated whether tradition had a place in today's world. The pressure is building. And yet, amid all the gossip, the glares, and the doubts, Alina stands firm. She didn't seek out attention, nor did she cower from the cold stars. She walked the palace halls with quiet dignity, knowing every step she took was watched by those hoping to see her fail and those quietly rooting for her to endure. In the end, Charles addressed the palace in his usual understated way. No grand speech in the ballroom, no public declarations, just a brief private message to his staff. Tradition isn't about standing still. It's about carrying forward what matters and leaving behind what doesn't. Loyalty, wisdom, and courage can be found in the unlikeliest of places. And in this palace, those who earn trust will keep it. The message is clear. Alina is here to stay, at least for now. Thank you for staying with us. Do you think Prince William will eventually fire Alina as part of his royal reform? Share your opinions with us in the comments section. If you enjoyed the video, like, share, and subscribe to our channel.